Thank you for attending. This is I think the best we've had in the School of Humanities lecture series. This is the first one of the new year, and there's a variety of talks over this semester and next semester. On the door there's a poster, but there's also advertised on the School of Humanities website. So I think there's 4 or 5 this semester, 4 or 5 next semester. So look out for those and attend if you can. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Walter Englert from Reed College, Portland, Oregon. And Walter is going to give a talk. We have to get out of here by 1 o'clock, so hopefully we'll have 10 minutes for questions. But Walter's talk is on, title is Philosophy in Cicero's Speeches. Walter.
Thanks very much. Thank you all for turning out. It's a real pleasure to be here in such a beautiful city and also an amazing university. So thank you for hosting me. I want to thank particularly a few people, Catherine Steele and James Brady, for helping to make this talk possible, and also Christelle Larigor for the practical arrangement so this could happen too. I realize that we have some time constraints. I'll try and talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. There may be a few places where I sort of summarize just to kind of keep us on schedule. But what I wanted to do is sort of situate why this talk now. Why am I talking about philosophy in Cicero's speeches? I'm working on a project now, a book that I'm about halfway through, which really tries to answer the question, why and how does Cicero take Greek philosophy? And I just want to emphasize how Greek philosophy was in the ancient world. It really was a Greek cultural product, and to the Romans it would have been seen in the 2nd and 1st centuries as something really Greek, to be done in Greek, and something that they knew something about, and some Romans were actually pretty well educated in Greek philosophy, but they really did see it as something Greek. And so my project with Cicero is to sort of see how Cicero, and he's writing at the same time as Lucretius, who is also kind of taking Epicurean philosophy and trying to make it into something Roman, but how does Cicero attack this project? And what does it mean to Cicero to take a Greek product like philosophy and make it into a Roman product, which eventually I think in Cicero he uses the name philosophia in Latin for it, but I think between Greek philosophy and Roman philosophia, he has a whole process he has to go through to figure out what is philosophy for the Romans. What can we keep from Greek philosophy? How does it have to be modified to get it to be something that is no longer something that we think of as primarily Greek, but as an activity we do for the Romans, and we get something out of it as Romans. And so what I'm doing in my work, in my book project, is going through Cicero work by work to see how he represents philosophy and what his strategies are for introducing philosophy or rethinking philosophy for his Roman audience. And I really see him as someone who, work by work, is improvising and experimenting as he goes. I think there's no one answer for Cicero, but I think he's trying on different approaches as he writes his different works to figure out how to do Roman philosophy. And in my talk today, this is part of the project, what I'm going to talk about today is how does Cicero talk about philosophia or philosophy in his speeches? Now obviously in his speeches, they're not works of philosophy. His main goal is to persuade his audience, the jurors or the audience he's speaking to, so that he gets them to vote for his side. But I think in the speeches, he can talk about different topics, and including philosophy, and he can sort of reflect the prejudices of his audience, but he can also begin to shape what the audience thinks about philosophy as he's trying to get them to vote for his side of the argument in these speeches. And the surprising thing, I think, that's emerged so far, and again, I'd very much welcome feedback on this, but I think there are 2 main ways, not just one way, but 2 ways that Cicero talks about Romans doing philosophy. And this is on the handout. This is the first section on terms. It seems like it falls out in 2 different ways. There are lots of Roman/Latin terms that you can use for what we would call philosophical activity. sapiens, sapientissimus, so the wise person, the really wise person, and then a lot of terms that sometimes are hard to translate into English, which are about how do you call someone learned, someone who studied philosophical doctrine. He uses these, I think, pretty well. And this isn't kind of the difference really is with another group of words that focus on the Greek word philosophia, which are translated into Latin as philosophus or philosopher, philosophia, pretty direct, taking over from the Greek philosophy, and then the verb philosophare, to do philosophy. And my argument is that in the speeches, the second group of terms, the philosophia group of terms, is really heavily Greek identified. And so we'll see in some speeches he doesn't use it at all when he's talking about philosophy. And in other speeches, he really uses the term philosophia when he wants it to be Greek identified for particular purposes. But I think this is part of a process we see in his speeches as he's taking the Greek philosophia and turning it into something that Romans can use, even if it's still by the time he's through these speeches, it's still kind of Greek identified. But I think he's on the road to helping his audience see, oh, maybe philosophy, and some of the stuff we can get from the Greeks will be really useful for us as Romans. And then on the rest of the handout, and we'll be going through some close readings of some passages, but I've just listed some speeches by year. You can see the Pro Ruscio Amarino that I really will barely mention from the year 80 BCE, and then in 63 the Pro Murena, and then I have just the sections of the speech that we'll look at. And then a few more speeches in 62, the Pro Archia, in 57, the Post Reditum, or after his return from exile in the Senate, 56, the Pro Sestio, 56 BCE, the Pro Caelio, and then finally, a speech I'll spend a lot of time on, the In Pisonum, or the Against Piso, from 55. So we'll be looking at speeches, primarily the Pro Milone, and then the In Pisonum. So this will just be the handout that we'll be going through. So in this paper, we'll explore two speeches primarily of Cicero, where philosophy is prominently featured, but treated in very different ways. That's the Pro Murena in 63 BCE, and I've just summarized a few things here about the Pro Murena, which discusses philosophy extensively without using the Greek-derived term philosophia and its cognates. In other words, philosophia does not occur in this speech. The other words for Latin words that we looked at in section 1 about philosophical activities do. And then contrasting that with the In Pisonum, primarily, where Cicero attacks Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who was an Epicurean and who had an Epicurean teacher named Philodemus, where Cicero uses all over the place philosophia and philosophos as terms. And we'll talk about why doesn't he use philosophia in the Pro Murena when he's attacking Cato and Cato's Stoicism, and why does he use the term quite heavily, philosophia, in the In Pisonum. Between my discussion of these two speeches, I'll also briefly look at a few other speeches where Cicero does use the term philosophia and why he might be doing that. Cicero rarely discussed philosophy or philosophical activity in his speeches before 63 BCE, that's before the Pro Murena. In speeches he gave in the 80s, including the Pro Ruscio Amarino that I mentioned on the handout, Cicero uses general terms like humanitas, sapientia, general Roman term for wisdom, and related terms, but he never makes philosophy or philosophical education an important subject of his discussion, and this changes in the Pro Murena. In the Pro Murena, Cicero faced a difficult rhetorical problem. I'll go just back to the Pro Murena. Marcus Porcius Cato, or Cato the Younger, the famous Roman Stoic, was one of the prosecutors in the case, and he had attacked Lucius Licinius Murena in his speech as clearly guilty of bribery. Cato, as one of the most influential Romans of his day, had great auctoritas, And to win the case, Cicero needed to find a way to neutralize Cato's moral attack on Murena. He wanted to make sure that the jury had a reason not to be persuaded by Cato's attack. He also wanted to attack, though, Cato in a way that did not completely alienate him, because in many ways he and Cato were political allies and on the side of the Senate. Cicero did this by making an issue of Cato's Stoicism, suggesting that Stoicism made Cato too rigid and almost un-Roman in his prosecution of Murena. Cicero combats Cato's moral authority by taking aim at his philosophy and distinguishes between Cato the man and his Stoic philosophical position. It's the fault, what Cato's doing in the speech, attacking Murena, is the fault of his Stoicism, not sort of Cato as a person. And Cicero tries to present Cato's Stoicism as out of sync with accepted Roman values so that he can win the case without offending Cato and the jury. Now, to carry out his plan, Cicero needed to represent Stoicism in a way that was not completely dismissive. He did this by characterizing Stoicism and Cato's attraction to Stoicism as consistent with Roman tradition up to a point, but as ultimately too extreme in ways that were detrimental to Cato and to Roman society. He just thinks Cato takes his Stoicism too far. And as part of this process, when discussing Cato and Stoic education, Cicero scrupulously avoids using, as I mentioned, the Greek-derived terms philosophia and its cognates, like philosophy and philosopher. Instead, he uses Latin terms for philosophical activity throughout, sapientes, doctrina, disciplina, etc. And though he also names Greek philosophers and schools, he does so without specifically labeling these people as philosophers or emphasizing their Greekness. So he mentions Zeno, the founder of Stoicism. He mentions the Stoici, the Stoics. He mentions Plato, Aristotle, the Stoic philosopher Panaetius, and other famous earlier Romans who studied philosophy, like Scipio Africanus, Laelius, and Quintus Tubero. But he never sort of identifies Plato and the Stoics specifically as Greek. I mean, the audience would know they are, but he doesn't make an issue out of their Greekness. Cicero's technique in the speech is subtle, humorous, and effective. When he reaches the point in his speech, when he introduces his initial characterization of Cato in sections 58 to 60, he praises Cato and asks the jury not to be overawed by all of Cato's gravitas, auctoritas, and other formidable virtues. And he reminds the audience that he wants them to find Murena innocent of bribery. So Cicero then notes that he can't criticize Cato's wisdom or judgment, but Cicero says, and this isn't on the handout, perhaps I'll be able to shape and lightly correct some things about Cato. And it's at this point that Cicero gradually makes the transition to Cato's Stoicism. In section 60 on the handout, Cicero makes an important distinction. He contrasts the different roles that nature, natura, and teaching or doctrina played in shaping Cato. He states that nature or natura made Cato a virtuous and great man, but the teaching or a type of education, that is philosophical doctrina, though he doesn't use the word philosophy, that is neither moderate nor mild, that made him a little too harsh and rugged in ways that neither truth nor nature allows. In other words, it's Stoicism that's the problem with Cato. He's taking it too seriously. And note that Cicero doesn't immediately identify the teaching, the doctrina, as Stoicism. At this point, he just leaves it sort of general. But he's already begun dropping hints that some jurors may have started to pick up on, that the problem is Stoicism. At this point in section 61, Cicero directly addresses and flatters the jury, saying that it's because he's speaking to neither an ignorant crowd or some gathering of rustics. That's certainly not the jurors. He will boldly discuss the study of liberal arts, the studia humanitatis, with them, which he says is known and loved by all of them. So he's buttering up the jury at this point. But with this statement, Cicero moves more deeply into a discussion of philosophy, again praising Cato and identifying his only flaws as coming not from Cato's nature, but his teacher, his magister. Cicero then mentions the name of his teacher and the school. He praises Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, as a man of the highest genius, and says that Zeno's followers are called Stoici, the Stoics. Cicero then lists a number of Stoic paradoxes, such as the wise person is never moved by favor, the wise person never forgives anyone's transgressions, to give the audience a sense of how rigid and far removed Stoic ethical teachings are from standard Roman practices. Now in section 62, Cicero next says that Cato, a most intelligent person, led astray by these most learned authorities, went too far. He did not treat these Stoics' teachings as things spoken for the sake of argument, in other words, theoretical things, as most people do, but took them as, but studied them, excuse me, for the sake of living in this way. And with this rhetorical move, Cicero continues to stress his major theme. Cato's a good person, but he's been misled by the teaching of the Stoics to the point where he's lost track of how a Roman should live. Now, lest the jury think that he considers all philosophical learning as alien to Roman culture and politics, Cicero contrasts Cato's education with his own. That's the education of Cicero. Like Cato, he says, when Cicero was young, he didn't trust his own abilities and he sought help in education. But unlike Cato, Cicero says in section 63, he turned to the teachings of Plato and Aristotle, not the Stoics. Plato and Aristotle, who stressed a mean in all things. As he had in the case of Zeno, Cicero treats Plato and Aristotle respectfully. He does not use the term philosophy to describe them, but employs a more neutral phrase. He calls them moderati homines et temperati, moderate and temperate people. If Cato had studied the works of Plato and Aristotle, Cicero notes, he would not be any more virtuous than he is now. That would be impossible. Who could be more virtuous than Cato, he playfully suggests. But it would have inclined him to more leniency. So Cicero refines his critique further in what follows. Whereas earlier Cicero had stressed the difference between the qualities that nature had bestowed on Cato and that Cato had learned from Stoic teaching, Cicero now links them. He represents Cato as attacking Murena, carried away by the force of his nature and character, and burning with his recent studies of Stoic precepts. Cicero holds out hope that Cato will soon become better with age as he mellows, because he's a pretty young man at this point. Unless Cicero have given the impression that Stoicism is as harsh as he's made it out so far, he raises another possibility to explain Cato's error with Stoicism. And that is that Cato is making it, that Stoicism in fact isn't even as extreme as Cato is making it. And Cicero suggests, well, maybe his instructors and teachers of virtue, his Stoic teachers, might have wanted us to strive for an extreme of virtue. In other words, it's saying you should really go all out for virtue, so that even if we don't achieve perfect virtue, we'll fall somewhere sort of on, pretty close to virtue, and we can end up where it's necessary for us to be. And he's almost giving an Aristotelian doctrine of the mean twist on Stoicism that I think the Stoics would reject, but I think he's saying this is how Cato could have done it. And Cicero also, at that point, thinks, well, maybe instead of being a strict Stoic Cato and saying, never forgive, what we should do is be a modified Stoic and say something like, well, nay, rather, forgive something, but not everything. So he's saying, here's how Cato might act if he was a bit of a modified Stoic. And to drive home further how one might successfully combine Stoic doctrine and Roman values, Cicero brings up the example of some famous Romans from generations past, including Scipio Africanus, who associated with the Stoic teacher Panetius, and Cicero says became very gentle and suggests that Stoicism had similar effects on other famous Romans of the period. In other words, unlike Cato, he's saying earlier Romans who studied Stoicism actually were moderate people. They didn't go over the deep end with Stoicism like Cato seems to be. Finally, Cicero in this section talks about Cato the Elder, who's the great-grandfather of Cato the Younger, and a famous voice of the mos maiorum, or the traditions of the ancestor. And he picks up sort of Cato the Elder and says, Cato, you should follow the example of your great-grandfather, Cato the Elder, and he mellowed as he got older. So should you. You shouldn't think that, extreme stoicism is the way to imitate your great ancestor. So Cicero then transitions to examining the individual charges against Murena and argues point by point that the jurors should now take Cato out of the picture. Cato is taking things too extremely when he claims to find things that prove Murena was guilty of bribery. He just says Cato's going off the deep end, and he's really wrong about Murena. And Cicero's audience, Cicero says, might think at this point, Cicero's audience might at this point think that Cato's Stoicism, or Cicero's discussion of Stoicism is over, but in section 74 he returns to it, saying that Cato treats Murena severely and stoicae, like a Stoic, when he denies that goodwill should be sought with a banquet. And one of the complaints that Cato apparently had is that Murena's putting on free meals for the Roman people, and that's sort of bribing them. And so then Cicero takes the example of Quintus Tubero, a Stoic of an earlier generation, and Cicero says, don't be like Quintus Tubero, whose Stoicism had caused him to scrimp on expenses at the very important funeral of Scipio Africanus the Younger, and commit a grave social and political faux pas. This is the last section on the handout from the Pro Murena Cicero in section 75. And this is what Cicero says about the example of Quintus Tubero. There was from the same school, in other words, the Stoics, among our ancestors, a learned man and an honest and noble person, Quintus Tubero. And so this learned person and Stoic covered Punic dining couches with little goatskin hides and put out Samian ware as if it were Diogenes the Cynic who had died, and it was not the death of that godlike man, Africanus, Scipio Africanus, who was being honored. And so this is an example of an earlier Stoic who had really been chintzy about the funeral and had just made, it'd be like you're going to a great banquet and there are a few crackers on the table or something like that. You'd think, wow, this guy should have put on a much better spread for this occasion. And so Cicero is saying, Cato, don't be like Tubero. Don't be stingy, inappropriate, and un-Roman. Well, so to sum up the Pro Murena, what does Cicero do in it? Well, Cicero's treatment and philosophy in this speech is remarkable in several ways. Cicero brings up Cato's Stoicism in order to diffuse Cato's attack on Murena. He does this skillfully and in a way that allows him to play with his audience's view of the relationship of philosophy to Roman life, and to criticize Cato for holding views under the influence of Stoicism that are too extreme. Cicero does this, however, without painting too negative a picture of Cato. He doesn't criticize Cato for studying philosophy, but for possibly studying the wrong philosophical school and for taking what he learned from the Stoics too seriously. The terms that Cicero chooses to use and not to use in his description of Cato are important. He uses terms like studium, doctrina, eruditus, etc., Roman terms for learning and study, again, which are vaguely philosophical to a Roman ear in positive ways. And he uses the names of Greek philosophers like Zeno, Plato, Aristotle, Panaetius, and others, and Romans of the past who studied Stoicism effectively, like Scipio Africanus, and not so effectively, like Quintus Tubero in his bad banquet that he had set out. But surprisingly, the words philosophia, philosophos, and philosophare, the really heavily Greek-identified words, don't appear in the speech. Nor does Cicero stress the Greekness of the Stoics and other philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Panaetius that he names. Cato is given a philosophical break in the speech. Cicero represents him as coming close to integrating Stoic philosophy into Roman life and politics, but ultimately as failing because he lacked the ability to unite them sensibly. If Cicero had used the terms philosophia, philosophos, and philosophare, I think as we'll see in the In Pisonem, and other terms which called attention to the Greekness of philosophy, it would have been harder to see Cato as being really Roman, and I think it would have put him perhaps in the more non-Roman class of philosophia, of doing Greek philosophy. Now let's just quickly look at a few speeches between the Promurena and the In Pisonem, and again, there are a few passages on the handout. In the speeches that follow the Promurena, Cicero does begin to utilize a more Greek philosophical vocabulary than in previous years. In the Proarchia of 62, on behalf of Archias, which contains the first use of philosophos in his speeches, and the Post Reditum in Senatu, after his return into the Senate in 57, and the Procestio in 56, Cicero begins to construct a picture of the philosophos, again using that term, as a Greek philosopher and philosophia, or Greek philosophy, as a discipline, which are largely unintegrated into Roman society, but have the potential either to improve or seriously damage Roman culture, depending on how they're applied. The Proarchia in 62 was largely a defense of the place of Greek things, including education, in the Roman world. And in order to defend his friend and poet Archias from charges concerning his citizenship, Cicero argued that the literary arts and studies, referred to throughout this speech as studia, litera, and doctrina. He doesn't use philosophia in this speech, except in a special case, and we'll see where, are not compatible with, but Cicero is arguing, but they're beneficial for Roman political life and ideals. And the first use of philosophos in Cicero's speeches appears in the Proarchia, but not in a section where he's discussing education or philosophical studies, but rather in a section on ambition, or studium laudis, the desire for praise, where he uses the word to make a gentle joke at the expense of philosophers to illustrate a point he wants to make. And this is the quote on the handout. Even those very philosophers inscribe their names on those books that they write on disparaging glory. And here the joke is on these really virtuous, supposedly, Greek philosophers who put their name in really big print on the book, saying, here's why you shouldn't worry about being famous, or something like that, and then having your name in all big caps. So he's, again, making fun of philosophers who say one thing and do another. And the main reason he mentions them, philosophy, is to illustrate his point perfectly. Everyone, even philosophers who disparage fame, in fact, actually desire it. Now, when Cicero returned to Rome in 57 BCE, after an 18-month exile, he delivered a speech before the Senate called the Post Reditum in Senatu, after his return into the Senate, in which he attacked L. Calpurnius Piso and his colleague Gabinius, who were consuls in 58, for doing nothing to prevent Cicero's exile. Cicero singles out Piso in particular as a corrupt and degenerate politician, and shapes his picture of him in the Post Reditum in Senatu by emphasizing his Epicurean background. And this is on the handout. But indeed, when he, that is L. Calpurnius Piso, began to apply himself to literature, and this wild brute began to philosophize with Greeklings, then he became an Epicurean, but was not completely dedicated to that system, whatever it is, but was captivated by a single word, pleasure. And again, that's the goal of Epicurean philosophy, that Cicero's audience would have some dim awareness of, that Epicureans thought that pleasure was the highest good. This is an important passage that foreshadows Cicero's treatment of Piso 2 years later in the In Pisonem. He describes Piso's literary and philosophical education in far different terms than he had Cato's and his own education in the Promurena, and this ideal literary and philosophical education outlined in the Proarchia. Here Cicero describes how Piso, a Roman with a nature so corrupt that he's called a wild brute, a belloa humanis, who began first to study literature and then to philosophize with Greeklings, cum Graeculis philosophare. And the air of contempt that surrounds Piso's philosophizing here places the action in a realm that's non-Roman and unbecoming for a consul. Cicero calls Piso an Epicurean in this passage, and you can really feel the disdain. He philosophizes, and then he uses a derogatory term for Greeks, not just Greeks, but with Greeklings. It's like doing this really weird Greek thing, philosophy with weird little Greeks, or something like that. So he's really using it against Piso in that speech. Now, Cicero's criticism of Piso's improper engagement with philosophy continues in the Procestio in 56. And in that defense, Cicero again takes issue with Piso's philosophical education. He tells the jury that the learned man, and he's being very sarcastic here, this homo doctus, used to praise some philosophers, philosophos, whose name Cicero pretends in this speech not to know. These men were authorities and enthusiasts of pleasure. And he's undoubtedly talking about Epicureans, and the use of the word philosophy here distances the school from Roman public life. Cicero could have mentioned these philosophers without using the term philosophy by calling them teachers or something like that. But he seems to want to use, again, the term philosophos to emphasize that these people are foreign to Roman life. Now, I'll just skip over the Procailio, but there's a passage there where it's clear he's talking about philosophy, but without using the word philosophos, again, because he's talking about Caelius, who he wants to present in a good light, and he's not trying to sort of, how would I say, he's not trying to criticize studying philosophy, and so he doesn't use the more derogatory terms, philosophia, in that case. Now, turning to back to the In Pisonem, Cicero's criticism of Piso and Epicureanism culminates in the In Pisonem, delivered in 55 BCE. In it, he portrays Piso in as negative a light as possible, as he possibly can. And he develops the approach he first took in the Post Reditum in Senatu and Procestio, the excerpts that we just looked at. Cicero does not directly attack Epicureanism, but he portrays it in an easily misunderstood and misrepresented philosophy that Piso embraces in an ignorant, harmful, and destructive way. To carry out his plan, Cicero needed to represent Epicureanism and its representatives, especially Piso's unnamed associate, though it's clear who it is, the Epicurean philosopher and poet Philodemus, in a way that portrayed the philosophy as inconsistent with Roman traditions and values. And in the speech, Cicero uses the term philosophia and philosophos multiple times in nuanced ways. And rather than simply using these terms philosophia and philosophos in negative ways, though, he treats them as part of a strategy that places Piso and Philodemus on a spectrum between Greek and Roman values. And Cicero begins his account by associating philosophia with Greekness and highlighting its distance from Roman life. He then goes on to separate Piso from philosophia, so he begins to kind of pull them apart, excuse me, showing that he was not attracted by Philodemus and a true understanding of Epicurean philosophy. In other words, Piso is sort of an idiot, and he's being attracted to Epicureanism for the wrong reasons, simply because he loved pleasure, and here's a philosophy that said pleasure is good, so of course Piso is going to follow it. And as it first looks like that Cicero is holding Philodemus, the Epicurean philosopher, as blameless for Piso's vices, as well as a well-meaning but clueless Greek philosopher who's misunderstood by his Roman pupil, Piso. But I think Cicero goes further and shows that Philodemus and the role he plays in Piso's corruption is not so innocent. Ultimately, Cicero suggests that the philosopher Philodemus is in fact no true philosopher at all. In other words, not only is Piso not doing philosophy right, but Philodemus, the philosopher, doesn't understand philosophy. And Cicero is going to make this point in the passages we'll look at. In sum, Cicero's arguing, he shows that Piso is no true Roman, and Philodemus, the philosopher, no true philosopher. Well, how does Cicero do this? The first two places that Piso's Epicureanism is brought up in the speech are in section 20, where Cicero calls him a barbaro epicuro, a barbarian Epicurus, and in section 37, where Cicero addresses him as epicure noster, our fine Epicurus. And he doesn't elaborate on either phase, but they hint at themes that are going to recur later in the speech, that Piso's a follower of Epicurus, but not a good one. In sections 56 to 72, Cicero refines his attack on Piso's character and credibility, and he uses forms of the word philosophia and philosophos a remarkable 9 times. In sections 56, 58, 65, 68, 69, 70, twice in 71 and 72. And you can almost imagine that the words philosophia and philosophos are ringing out bang, bang, bang in this section, and that the audience, that Cicero is just kind of hitting them over the head with those words as he goes through this section talking about Piso and Philodemus. The first 3 uses of the term make fun of Piso by ironically calling Piso ironically a philosopher. In section 56, Cicero notes how Piso had declared that he was not interested in a military triumph, which of course every Roman consul would love a military triumph. But he's saying Piso has said, oh, no, I wouldn't want a military triumph. And Cicero says, well, but you hear, senators, the voice of a philosopher. In other words, saying that he didn't want a Roman triumph would make Piso, well, he's such a philosopher. And here, with the first appearance of Philosophus in the speech, Cicero simultaneously portrays Piso as not adhering to Roman values, in other words, he didn't want a triumph, and as hypocritical. Piso, Cicero implies, is pretending to make a point consistent with his Epicureanism, but he speaks with anything but the voice of a philosopher. In section 58, Cicero continues to ridicule Piso's denial that he wanted a triumph by noting that if Piso's aversion to triumphs is right, then Pompey the Great has been acting stupidly and incorrectly. But Pompey, erred. He had not partaken of this philosophy of yours, for the stupid man has already triumphed 3 times. Cicero mentions philosophy as he paints Piso as non-Roman, Greek, and devoted to philosophy. Again, Cicero's sarcasm was clear, especially when he labels Pompey the Great as stultus, a stupid man, i.e., the opposite of a philosophical, wise person, for performing an action that's so glorious from the Roman's perspective, but so misguided from a Greek philosophical perspective. Now, the last use of the word philosophos, as it's applied to Piso in the work, occurs at section 65, when Cicero taunts Piso, saying that he's so hated by all parts of Roman society that he will not dare attend the games that Pompey is putting on at the opening of Pompey's theater in Rome for fear of being jeered at by the people. And this is a handout, quote on the handout. Give yourself to the people, entrust yourself to the games. Do you fear hissing? Where are your school's lectures? Are you afraid to be shouted at? Not even this is something for a philosopher to worry about. Here again, Cicero applies the word philosopher ironically to Piso. Cicero shows throughout this section that Piso does not act like a Roman citizen, nor, in fact, does he act like a Greek philosopher. As a Roman, he should take part in the games, and as someone who is a philosopher, he shouldn't care about getting jeered at by people he might encounter there. Now, with the final 6 instances of philosophus or philosophia, those words that follow in the speech, Cicero switches gears. He doesn't apply the terms to Piso anymore, but to Piso's teacher, the Epicurean philosopher and poet Philodemus. Cicero doesn't mention Philodemus by name in the speech, but he begins by praising him, saying that he's bright, learned, a Greek, a Graikos, and he's cultured, he's humanus, at least when he's not in the company of Piso. Cicero relates how Piso became his associate, and at this point, as he did in the Prima Murena, Cicero compliments his audience and then goes more deeply into the philosophical matters, and this is section 68 in Pisonum on the handout. I'm speaking not among uneducated men, he's talking to his audience, but as I think in a gathering of very learned and cultured people. You've heard it said, of course, that Epicurean philosophers assess all things that men must seek in terms of pleasure. Whether rightly or otherwise, it doesn't concern us, or if it does concern us, it's not for the present occasion. But nevertheless, this is a slippery type of argument for a young man who is not very sharp intellectually, and it often ends in disaster. In this passage, Cicero seems to be including the unnamed Philodemus among the philosophers of Epicurus. He informs his audience about the Epicurean view of pleasure and takes some doubts and leaves some doubts in the mind of his audience about the value of this philosophy. Cicero questions whether it's right to posit pleasure as the measure of things to be sought, and he notes that the arguments Epicureans make for pleasure can be tricky and dangerous for people who are not very bright, in other words, like Piso. Cicero continues in section 69, making another reference to philosophy. And so this stallion, that's Piso, as soon as he heard pleasure praised to such an extent by a philosopher, that's Piso, inquired no further. So much did it stimulate all of his pleasure-seeking sensations, and so much did he whinny at the teaching of his, that's Philodemus's, that he thought he had found not a teacher of virtue, but an advisor about lust. So in other words, Piso was so happy to find a teacher who was saying, pleasure is everything. And Cicero makes an interesting move here, because Philodemus, again labeled the philosopher in this passage, is shown to have been an unsuccessful teacher of Piso. Piso seized on the term pleasure that he heard Philodemus use, acted like a stallion whinnying with delight, and took Philodemus not as a teacher of virtue, but an advisor on lust. And this last contrast is telling, because Cicero here first hints at the position he develops further in this part of the speech, that a genuine philosophus should teach virtue and not lust. Now, in what immediately follows in 69 to 70, Cicero contrasts Piso, a Roman commander, with Philodemus, a Greek philosopher. He portrays Philodemus as one who is in awe or afraid of Piso, and who fails to correct Piso's false view of Epicureanism. And this is what he says in 69 to 70. The Greek, Philodemus, easygoing and quite charming, did not wish to be overly combative against a commander of the Roman people. But he about whom I'm speaking is completely polished when it comes to not only philosophy, but also other pursuits which they say that nearly all Epicureans neglect. And Cicero begins here to begin a darker and darker picture of Philodemus, and shows that Philodemus, sort of unlike Epicureans, that Philodemus was really interested in poetry. Epicurus himself, said you shouldn't really be that interested in poetry. And he begins to make Philodemus, so he begins to separate Philodemus. He'd been talking about him as a philosophos, but he now makes the move of separating Philosophia from Philodemus. So Philodemus, in fact, is not going to be a philosopher anymore. And this brings us to sections 71 and 72 in the speech, in which three uses of the terms philosophia and philosophos occur in quick succession. This is where they're the thickest in the speech. But if he, Philodemus, had been more fortunate in inquiring a student, perhaps he would have been able to be more austere and severe. But chance led him into this type of writing exceedingly unworthy of a philosopher, in other words, writing erotic poetry. If indeed philosophy, as they say, encompasses the systematic study of virtue and duty and living well, and he who professes it seems to me to undertake the most serious of roles. In other words, if you're professing philosophy, it's a serious job. But that same chance defiled him, that is, defiled Philodemus, ignorant as he was about what he was professing when he called himself a philosopher, with the mud and filth of this foulest and most unrestrained beasts, Piso. So Cicero suggests that Philodemus's role as a philosopher and poet diverged so much that he can't really be called a genuine philosopher anymore. Cicero, in a sense, is stripping Philodemus of the very title of philosophos. And Cicero explains why, because philosophy, as he points out, should be understood as the systematic study of virtue, duty, and living well. And that's certainly not, Cicero saying, what Philodemus is teaching. Philodemus calls himself a philosopher, but doesn't genuinely practice philosophy. Now, Cicero's use of philosophical vocabulary and themes in the In Pisonum is thus extraordinary. He uses the terms philosophia and philosophos in it more times, way more times than in any other speech, and he employs them all to make the case against Piso as damaging as possible. And as we've seen, Cicero uses philosophy very strategically in the speech. As part of his attempt to show that Piso is degenerate and non-Roman, he first introduced Piso as an Epicurean and as a Greek pleasure lover, and then shows him not to be a real Epicurean and not to have understood his Epicurean teacher. Cicero then turns on his teacher Philodemus and initially sympathizes with him for having such a terrible student. And Cicero's sympathy, though, vanishes as he slowly demonstrates that this Epicurean philosopher is in fact not really a true philosopher at all. He's been corrupted by his student. So where does this leave Cicero's audience? In the In Pisonem, Cicero has set out a scale of lives. I think from truly Roman and virtuous lives at the one end to a true Greek philosophical and virtuous life on the other. And in between, I think he's shown that there's Piso, a Roman who's so corrupt that he ceased to be a Roman in the worst embrace possible of Greek culture. And he's shown that the unnamed Philodemus, Piso's teacher, has been corrupted so much that he embraces not true philosophia in the Greek sense, but the more decadent parts of Greek culture right along with his student. And really, as I said, he strips him of the title of philosopher. Piso fails, in other words, to be Roman, and Philodemus fails to be a Greek philosopher. So to conclude, I'd just like to suggest that in Cicero's speeches from 77 to 55, Cicero's main goals were to persuade his audience and win cases. But as part of this effort, Cicero at times discussed Greek philosophy, philosophers, and the benefits and dangers of them for his fellow Romans. The picture that Cicero presents in his speeches during this period is that this cultural contact can be valuable, but it's also really dangerous. Some Romans, such as Cato and Piso, who embrace Stoicism and Epicureanism in harmful ways, have to be careful, while other Romans, including Scipio Africanus and Laelius from an earlier generation, and perhaps in this current generation, and perhaps I think Cicero is representing himself as engaging with Greek philosophers in more productive and less destructive ways. In his speeches, then, Cicero seems to imply that a Roman should never try to be a philosophos, that is, a Greek philosopher. A Roman can't do this without ceasing to be a good Roman. But, and I think this is what Cicero is going to take as he moves in the same year that he was giving the In Pisonem, he's writing his great work, the De Oratora, on the nature of oratory, where he's talking about the orator should study philosophy. I think in the speeches we can see Cicero moving to the idea that a Roman can, with care, and if he or she chooses the right Greek philosopher or philosophy to follow, in fact become a better Roman by studying Greek philosophy. Thanks.
Great. We have time for a couple of questions. So, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I thought it was very interesting presentation about Cicero. I've got a question in regards to the comparison of the two speeches. So
yes.
in one in Pro Morena, he doesn't use Greek terms like philosophy and philosophers, or he uses like Latin equivalents.
Yes.
In Pisonem, he uses the Greek terms, but in a negative way. So is that actually equal comparison? Would it not be? Is there maybe speeches where he uses the terms philosophy and philosopher in a positive way?
Not that I've found.
Okay.
Yes, and I mean, I'm really trying to feel this out, and I'm not, 100% sure about everything about this. But kind of where I see the endpoint that Cicero is going towards is being able to use philosophy in his philosophical works later on in his life as a term that he can rehabilitate from its negative senses. And in his early philosophical works, he has prefaces in those works where he apologizes for Romans doing philosophy. He sort of explains, why would a Roman do philosophy in the Greek sense. And I think he's working out in his philosophical works how to do that. In the speeches where it's a more popular, speaking to the Romans in general, I think he's trying to, and for specific purposes in the two speech, talk about philosophical activities as part of his argument. And I guess I'm trying to suggest that you can see in the speeches that to describe philosophical activity in attractive ways, you'd use more Latinate, or more the more Latin vocabulary. And at the time he was even with the in Pisonem, philosophia in a popular context could be a negative term. It's like Greek eggheads, or something like that, or Greek. And so I think what he's trying to do is to find a way, even in the in Pisonem, it has a negative sense, but I think he's trying to begin to show us, no, there's a positive sense it could have, but it didn't, for Piso and Philodemus, it's definitely not a positive.
And therefore the Latin equivalents are also never negative?
No, I mean, he does use some of those terms in the in Pisonem, but he really wants to make what Piso and Philodemus are doing look sinister and non-Roman.
Very quickly.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, just a small curiosity. What
Sure.
is the, in 60, in Proverena, what is the translation of doctrina teaching? Does it, the obvious translation that comes to mind, of course, would be doctrine. And
Yes.
the difference seems to be that teaching is more a communicative act, where doctrine is more just a
Yeah.
set of ideas or an account.
Yes, I think I find it really hard to translate easily into English the Roman words for kind of like doing philosophy or studying philosophy, like doctrina. And a lot of times, if you look at English translations, people will use philosophy without thinking about it as translations too much. I think doctrina could be something like teaching, but it can also mean, as you're saying, philosophical doctrine or something like that.
I'm thinking that it might actually be important because if the blame, as it were, is put on teaching, it may well be put on the communicative act, so on the teacher,
Yes.
rather than on the doctrine, on the philosophical
Yes.
account
Yes.
that's being taught.
That's a really good point. I think there is some slippage in the Roman term doctrina, but in some ways I think he's trying to keep it a little bit vague too, just to talk about, intellectual activity having to do with, Stoicism or something like that.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Let's
Okay.
thank Paul for a fascinating
Thank you very much. Thanks.